Ever wonder what Netflix and chill looked like 2,000 years ago? Or what it felt like to be stuck in traffic without cars, honking horns, or Uber rides? Forget the gladiators and emperors for a moment, because today, we're stepping away from the roar of the Colosseum and walking into the homes, streets, and hidden corners of Rome itself. We're diving into the surprisingly relatable, often hilarious, and sometimes deeply painful daily routines of ordinary people. The morning in Rome began, not with the alarm buzz of an iPhone, but with the sharp crow of a rooster, the clang of metal from blacksmiths setting up, or the cries of street vendors already hawking bread. Imagine waking up in a cramped apartment block, the insula where the walls were thin, your neighbors' arguments became your lullabies, and the smell of yesterday's fish stew clung to the wooden beams. For the poor, this was normal life. 5, sometimes 6 stories stacked high with families who shared the same narrow stairwells and public latrines. Fires were common, collapses frequent, and dignity often scarce. Yet still, people endured. A Roman morning was a performance of survival and routine. Men washed quickly with cold water drawn from a fountain in the street. Women tied their hair with practiced hands, pinning it up with ivory combs or wooden sticks. Children begged for scraps of bread, often dunked into watered-down vignettes. Wine at breakfast was not a luxury but a necessity, since clean water was never guaranteed. But beneath these rhythms lay the hidden pulse of inequality. For while the poor carried buckets, the wealthy reclined in sprawling villas, servants rushing to fill their marble basins with water warmed just right. The daily divide was not simply between rich and poor, but also between Roman and enslaved. Slavery was the invisible backbone of Rome's daily life. Imagine the city buzzing with over 500,000 people, and almost 1/3 of them were enslaved. They rose earlier than anyone else, lit the fires, prepared meals, fetched water, dressed their masters, and endured whips for the smallest mistake. Yet their lives were not all faceless. Many were Africans, brought from Nubia, Egypt, and Carthage. Their stories buried beneath the triumphal arches celebrating Roman victories. Some became teachers, midwives, or scribes. Others were forced into brutal labor, chained to mills or mines where daylight never touched. Their presence is a haunting reminder that Rome's elegance was built upon stolen freedom. And yet, in the same breath, Rome could be startlingly, ordinary, shockingly modern even. By mid-morning, the streets filled with a rhythm any of us would recognize. The rush of a morning commute. Crowds surged through stone-paved alleys. Vendors shouting over one another like open-air advertisers. Wagons rattling with goods, and beggars lifting their hands in weary gestures that transcended centuries. Picture yourself trying to squeeze through a Roman street in your sandals, dodging donkey carts and stepping carefully to avoid, well, let's just say sanitation was more a theory than a practice. Public latrines existed, yes, but chamber pots were often emptied right out the window. If you've ever grumbled about traffic jams or potholes, the Romans had their own version: stone blocks raised in the streets to act as crosswalks, keeping feet dry from waste and filth. But daily life was not only about enduring, it was also about belonging. Romans carried pride in their routines, much like we do. They gathered in bathhouses not just to clean, but to socialize, gossip, and debate politics. Imagine walking into a massive hall echoing with laughter, steam rising as men and women in separate hours, of course, soaked in hot pools or sweated in saunas. Business deals were struck here, friendships cemented, rivalries whispered. For the poor who couldn't afford private luxuries, the baths were their theater, their cafe, their Netflix and chill. Still, the bathhouse was also a place of division. Wealthy patrons strolled in with perfumed oils and slaves carrying towels, while the working poor brought little more than their tired bodies. And then there were those excluded, entirely enslaved, people whose labor built the baths but whose sweat rarely touched the pools. Daily Roman life was not a single story of glamour, but an endless tug-of-war between privilege and survival. Food tells us much the same. Picture the Roman marketplace. Stalls stacked with olives glistening in the sun, wheels of cheese, figs so sweet they burst on the tongue, and fish still wriggling in baskets. For the wealthy, mornings might begin with honey-soaked bread, dates, and even exotic fruits imported from distant provinces. For the poor, a cheap porridge made of barley or wheat was breakfast, lunch, and often dinner. But across all classes, bread was life, the heartbeat of Rome, and when shortages struck, riots erupted. Hungry crowds stormed bakeries, demanding justice. To eat was not only survival, it was dignity. The dignity of daily life, however, was not shared equally. Black Africans in Rome, both free and enslaved, lived at the intersection of fascination and discrimination. Ancient writers marveled at their beauty, their athletic strength, their cultural traditions, but they also reduced them to stereotypes, just as we see in later centuries. Yet some Africans rose to prominence. Merchants who traded across the Mediterranean, soldiers stationed on frontiers, even priests who carried the gods of their homelands into Roman temples. Their presence reminds us that Rome was not a white marble city, but a kaleidoscope of cultures, languages, and colors. By midday, the hum of the Forum's beating heart was deafening. Imagine politicians raising their voices in marble halls, lawyers defending clients with fiery speeches, philosophers debating morality while merchants haggled over the price of cloth. For the poor, the Forum was where you might find a day's work as a porter or builder. For women, often excluded from public office, it was a place to weave networks, exchange gossip, and sometimes raise their voices. In protest, ancient Rome may have been patriarchal, but women, especially enslaved and marginalized women, were never silent. Their voices surface in curses etched on tablets, prayers carved into stone, and fragments of poetry that refused to be forgotten. The afternoon drifted on with the weight of labor. Farmers tilled fields outside the city, artisans hammered bronze, and enslaved workers endured back-breaking chores. For many, exhaustion was the constant companion. But even in the grind, there were sparks of joy. Children played games with nuts or carved dolls. Lovers exchanged notes scratched into wax tablets. Musicians strummed in taverns. These moments whisper across time that even in hardship, people sought laughter, love, and meaning. And then came evening, when the city shifted once more. Oil lamps flickered in taverns, casting shadows on walls stained with smoke. The poor dined on lentils or leftovers. The wealthy indulged in feasts of roasted meats, honey cakes, and wine flowing like rivers. Reclining on couches, they debated philosophy, or simply boasted of their wealth. But for the enslaved, evening was no release. It was often when they served most, tending fires, clearing plates, and enduring abuses cloaked in the night. Yet, among all this, there was resilience. Ordinary Romans, whether poor, enslaved, immigrant, or free, built lives of dignity in the cracks of empire. They found joy in music, laughter in games, hope in prayers, and defiance in survival itself. Their daily life may feel distant, but listen closely, and you'll hear the echo of your own routines. The morning rush, the search for food, the gossip shared among friends, the quiet longing for justice, it's all still here, living within us, 2,000 years later. As the night deepened, ancient Rome revealed a side often hidden from marble monuments and history books. The city's heartbeat didn't stop with the setting sun, it simply changed rhythm. Taverns came alive with laughter, slurred songs, and the clatter of dice. These were the spaces where the poor found escape, where stories were told, where small victories against hardship were celebrated. A sailor might boast of storms survived at sea. A soldier might recount battles fought on distant frontiers, while women, often overlooked in official records, sang lullabies to quiet their children in darkened rooms. The sounds were different from ours, but the yearning was the same: to rest, to belong, to be heard. Yet for many, rest was a privilege. Enslaved people often worked well into the night, their labor invisible yet essential. Some were ordered to recite poetry to their masters. Others forced into sexual servitude, their dignity stripped under the guise of Roman power. The walls of Rome's villas were painted with beauty, but behind them echoed cries never carved in stone. And still, within this cruelty, enslaved people resisted in small human ways. Through whispered songs, through sharing memories of homelands, through love that defied ownership. These quiet rebellions remind us that Rome's story was not just one of emperors, but of countless ordinary souls who refused to be erased. Morning always came too soon. For the poor, another day began with the same struggle: fetching water, searching for food, surviving the chaos of the city. For the wealthy, mornings brought leisure. Letters were dictated to scribes. Clients lined up outside the doors of patrons to beg for favors or employment. This ritual, called the salutatio, was the morning commute for Rome's ambitious. Imagine men dressed in togas, waiting like anxious job seekers, hoping for coins, influence, or simply acknowledgement. To be ignored was humiliation. To be granted favor was survival. In this system, power was currency, and dignity often hung by a thread. But Rome was never static. Festivals broke the monotony, turning daily life into spectacle. Picture streets draped in garlands, incense rising, music echoing as crowds gathered for feasts honoring Jupiter, Venus, or Saturn. During Saturnalia, masters served their slaves for a day, a symbolic inversion of power that offered laughter but no real justice. Children, too, played their part in Rome's daily story. They spun hoops, played ball games, and carved toys from wood. But their futures were already bound by class and status. A wealthy boy might study Greek philosophy, trained to argue in the forum, while a poor child learned the art of trade or the cruelty of labor for adolescence. Girls, often dismissed in history, lived lives of profound endurance. Married off young, many bore children in their teens, their names forgotten in official records. Yet in tombstones and graffiti, their voices whisper still: a girl's love for her family, a mother's grief for a lost child, a wife's plea for justice. Justice in Rome, however, was not blind. Courts favored the wealthy, and punishment for crimes was brutally uneven. A citizen might face exile for an offense, while an enslaved person could be crucified for the same act. Yet amid this cruelty, movements for dignity emerged. Freedmen, former slaves who earned or bought their freedom, fought fiercely for recognition. Many became merchants, artisans, and even wealthy patrons themselves. Their tombs still stand, etched with pride, declaring their names for history to remember. I was enslaved, but I rose. I lived with dignity. These stories pierce the marble silence, reminding us that resilience was the truest Roman legacy. Afternoons often belonged to the theater. Romans adored performances, comedies, tragedies, and bawdy farces filled open-air stages. Imagine laughter rolling through the crowd as actors mocked politicians, or gasps as mythological tales unfolded. Theater was entertainment, but also reflection. It mirrored society, exposing hypocrisy, voicing dissent that could not be spoken openly. For the poor, it was joy. For the enslaved, perhaps a moment to forget. For women, often excluded from power, it was a window into voices they rarely heard in real life. The stage carried truths that the Senate dared not speak. And then there were the games. Gladiators, charioteers, and athletes filled arenas with blood and cheers. The Colosseum is often remembered as the crown jewel of Roman spectacle, but daily games happened across the empire. Ordinary Romans craved distraction from hunger and injustice, and the empire fed them with bread and circuses. Yet not everyone cheered. Some saw cruelty in the blood spilled, especially when enslaved men, prisoners of war, or Africans captured in distant lands were forced into arenas. Still, even here, dignity sometimes flickered. Gladiators, often enslaved, became celebrities, admired for their courage and skill. Their fame was a rebellion against anonymity. They proved that even those Rome tried to break could rise as symbols of strength. Evenings drew the city back into itself. Markets closed, temples grew quiet, but the whispers of Rome continued in private spaces. Lovers exchanged secret notes, philosophers debated over wine, mothers tucked children into straw beds, and soldiers sharpened blades for the next campaign. The city exhaled, preparing to inhale again at dawn. But if you walked the streets at night, you'd see another Rome, the Rome of shadows. Thieves prowled alleys, women sold their bodies for survival, and the homeless curled against temple steps. By lamplight, the glitter of empire faded, leaving the raw truth of humanity: survival, desire, hope. Daily life in Rome was no single story. It was the laughter of children echoing in narrow streets, the cries of the enslaved muffled behind villa walls, the pride of freedmen carving their names in stone, the gossip of women at fountains, the hunger of the poor demanding bread, and the constant hum of resilience that carried the city forward. When we imagine Rome, it's tempting to picture only emperors and conquests. But the real Rome lived in its kitchens and courtyards, in its bathhouses and markets, in the ordinary routines of people who woke each morning and faced the world with a mixture of hope and weariness. Their struggles echo ours: inequality, discrimination, injustice, but also laughter, love, and dignity. And perhaps that's the secret Rome leaves us: not its emperors or monuments, but the reminder that history is built by ordinary lives. The poor who rose before dawn, the enslaved who endured yet resisted, the women who raised families against the odds, the Africans who brought culture and strength into Rome. Hardle of them shaped the empire as much as any Caesar. So next time you wonder what Netflix and chill looked like 2,000 years ago, or what it felt like to be stuck in a Roman traffic jam, remember, daily life in ancient Rome wasn't just about spectacle, it was about survival. It was about carving dignity in a world designed to deny it. And it was about leaving behind whispers that still reach us today, reminding us that the human story, no matter the century, is always closer than we think.